Hello, everybody. Hello. Thank you for coming out to Flyleaf and supporting your local independent bookstore and these wonderful panelists. Tonight we have a panel discussion on how the United States became the gun capital of the world in the 20th century and the repercussions experienced in our capital community. Our speakers are Andrew C. McKevitt, the John D. Winters Endowed Professor of History at Louisiana Tech University. He is the author of the recently published Gun Country, Gun Capitalism, Culture, and Control in the Cold War America. Paige Masten, a lifelong North Carolinian and UNC alum, is the Deputy Opinion Editor for the Charlotte Observer. She covers stories that impact people in Charlotte and across the state. And I'll give these to Paige, Andrew, our author, Andrew, and Kyle. Andrew Willinger is the Executive Director of the Duke Center for Firearms Law. He writes and comments on Second Amendment decisions and issues related to firearms law. Kyle Lumsden is the founder and president of Students Demand Action at UNC in Chapel Hill, here, a local chapter of the national organization dedicated to fighting for a future free from gun violence. She is currently a junior at UNC Chapel Hill. Thanks again for coming. You can get a copy of the book up front if you didn't already, and I'm sure Andrew would be happy to sign it for you after the talk. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. We are here, of course, to talk about Drew's fantastic book, Gun Country, but also to just have a conversation about gun violence and gun culture in America. And it's especially significant to be having this here because Chapel Hill is like a lot of other towns in America because it has experienced gun violence. On August 28th, 2023, a UNC graduate student shot and killed a professor in a building on UNC's campus, and it was surrounded by an hours-long lockdown that put everybody on UNC's campus in lockdown, but also the surrounding elementary school and middle school students in lockdown on their very first day of school. 2 weeks later as well, the campus went into lockdown again for another gun-related incident, which fortunately did not result in anyone being injured, but just the combination of those traumatic experiences led students to demand action from their representatives. It got the attention of the White House as well. So that is some of the important context in which we're having this conversation. So really excited to be here and to talk about this. So just to start out, Drew, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about the book and kind of where you got the idea from and sort of the origins of it.
Sure. Well, thanks everyone for being here. I appreciate the invitation to be here. And of course, thanks to all the UNC Press folks for helping to set this up and for helping to publish the book. So I am not a trained gun historian. I was not trained to do that. Most historians are not trained gun historians. There's very few people who go through graduate school for that sort of thing. I'm actually a trained historian of U.S. foreign relations and U.S. foreign policy. That's what my first book, in fact, was about. It was about the U.S.-Japan relationship in the 1970s and the 1980s. And I was working on that book as far back as 2005. And then that was my dissertation, essentially. And then I got a PhD, and I got a job in Louisiana in 2012, which was a place I knew very little about, and I knew even less about North Louisiana, because most people have no idea what North Louisiana is. It's not New Orleans, it's not Baton Rouge, it's South Arkansas. And so when I first moved to Louisiana, I was kind of curious about the local connection between this project I had been working on and my new home. Because part of what that project was about was how Americans engaged with Japanese culture at a local level, right? So how did what kind of impact did Honda have when it arrived in central Ohio in the early 1980s? I was kind of interested in that question. And so I think it began with something as simple as a Google search for Louisiana and Japan, Like, what could I learn? And I came across this incident that I knew nothing about, I hadn't heard about, which was the 1992 shooting death of a Japanese exchange student named Yoshi Hattori. It was October 1992. He's out looking for a Halloween party with a friend. He's dressed like John Travolta from Saturday Night Fever. He knocks on the wrong door. A woman answers, sees an Asian teenager in costume, screams for her husband to get the gun. He confronts Yoshi, and a couple minutes later, Yoshi is dead. And so this was a fascinating incident to me, in part because it's sort of horrific and had these echoes with things that were happening in the United States in 2012, 2013, when I first kind of learned about this. This was the moment of Trayvon Martin. But what was sort of unique about this case was that Yoshi's family, in the aftermath of the killing, and in the aftermath of the killer's acquittal, he's acquitted on manslaughter charges, that a jury rules that if a unarmed teenager knocks on your door and you're scared, you're justified in using deadly force. Yoshi's family in Japan and his host parents in Louisiana started a gun control campaign. And it was a really unique gun control campaign, which didn't look like ones I had seen before, because part of its pitch was the rest of the world can show us what a sane gun policy looks like. Look at Japan. Annually in Japan, there were in some years, fewer than 10 gun deaths. In the United States, at that moment in 1992, 30,000 gun deaths a year. So what can looking at the rest of the world teach us about the United States' unique gun problems? And so that set me off on a kind of archival hunt to try to answer that question and try to figure out where that question came from.
Well, if you haven't read the book, it's really fascinating to me because it kind of presents a way of thinking about guns in America and guns and just kind of the gun culture that we've created. Just a different way of thinking about it that I hadn't considered it before. So, Drew, for anyone who hasn't yet read the book, what is the big question that you try to answer in it?
Yeah, so the Yoshi thing is what inspired me, but that question of like, why is the United States so different in a global sense, that drove me all the way back to World War II. And the book begins with a historical question, or even a historical problem to solve, which is that in 1945, the United States had, as best we can tell, and counting guns in the United States is sort of a mystical art, but as best we can tell, the United States had maybe 45 million guns in civilian hands in 1945. Today, maybe upwards of 450 million. So 10 times as many guns across 75 or 80 years. There are not 10 times as many people as there were in 1945. There's maybe about 2.5 times as many people. So even if, which I fully accept, the United States was some sort of gun country and had a gun culture in the 18th and 19th centuries, what happens after 1945 to prompt that incredible stockpiling of guns in civilian hands, right? 2.5 times as many people, 10 times as many guns. How do we explain that? And I don't think historians have had any kind of explanation for it, in part because historians haven't really looked at it. When historians write about guns in US history, they write about the 18th century and colonial America and militias and the Second Amendment, as Andrew will tell us about. And in the 19th century, they write about the Wild West, and they write about Colt and Winchester and the origins of gun capitalism, essentially in the United States. But we don't have a good explanation for that incredible stockpiling, the acceleration of that stockpiling after 1945. And so that's the question I tried to answer. And I don't think that question can be answered with reference to a gun tradition in the 18th or 19th century, with reference to the Second Amendment. What really accelerates that, I argue, and which is what I write about throughout the book, is gun capitalism, is the flooding of the market in the 1950s and the 1960s, the consumer market, and the active building of a new consumer market for firearms in the 1950s and the 1960s. One of the things that really spurs that, which is where the book begins and kind of the narrative, is the arrival of millions of war surplus firearms in the United States. These are cheap guns made in Europe before and during the war, left on battlefields in Europe, left to rot and warp in European warehouses after the war. And there's a cohort of American capitalists, entrepreneurs, who see that supply there, knowing that that supply, there's nothing that can be done with it in Europe. And they connect that to growing demand in the United States. In a post-war United States that is now prosperous as a consequence of the victory in the war, that is looking to cash in on the peace dividend. And that, I argue, really kickstarts this tremendous growth from 45 million in 1945 to 450 million today.
Like I said, it's a really fascinating way to think about guns in our country that I never really thought about before. I think, Drew, you say in the book that there's just not enough we don't think enough about guns as just like a consumer product like anything else, which I just thought was really interesting to think about kind of how we've gotten to where we are. So I really recommend reading the book because it just kind of really helps better understand kind of how we got to this place and how we can move forward. But I also think an important part of the conversation about guns is the law, the laws that do exist, and as well as the laws that don't exist, and the ones that people would like to exist. So Andrew, could you explain a little bit about how the law has helped encourage such an expansion of gun ownership?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Paige, and I just want to thank Drew for inviting me here today. Happy to be here with all of you discussing these truly important issues. So, Drew's book is, I think, really an amazing analysis of what I think is an overlooked and really important period of history. I think you're going to hear a little bit from Kyle about sort of the policy activism and the community impact of gun violence. I come at these issues from a little bit of a different perspective, which is that of a lawyer. And so I'm going to try to give a brief overview of sort of Second Amendment law and where things stand today. But to try to situate this in the broader conversation, the way I often talk about this is that you have sort of three kind of overlapping requirements when you're thinking about policy changes or interventions to address gun violence in the United States. So first, any type of policy change would have to be effective, right? It would have to actually be empirically effective at reducing gun homicides, reducing firearm injuries, suicides, and so on. Second, it would have to be politically feasible, right? So it actually have enough popular support to be enacted within the relevant jurisdiction. And then third and finally, it has to be constitutional, right? It has to satisfy the legal doctrines surrounding the Second Amendment. And that third aspect is where I come in. That's what I spend most of my time writing and thinking about. I think it's become an increasingly important requirement and a higher hurdle in recent years, as I'll talk about briefly. I also think it's maybe the most misunderstood of those three requirements, right? You'll often hear people saying things about the Second Amendment that are really just political arguments or policy arguments, but they're sort of veiled in that language. So I think it's important for that reason. I thought I would talk, and I'll try to be brief. I sometimes give like hour-long presentations about this stuff, so it's a challenge, but I will be brief. I thought I would talk just about how there are aspects of Second Amendment law that you might characterize as new, and then aspects that you might characterize as old. And I'll start with the new. So the actual acceptance at the sort of federal court level of the Second Amendment that we're all familiar with, right? An individual right to keep and bear arms for things like self-defense is pretty new. That can be traced to a Supreme Court decision in 2008, District of Columbia versus Heller. And that was where the Supreme Court for the first time said that the federal Second Amendment protects a right to keep a gun in your home for private purposes like self-defense as opposed to militia-related purposes. And going back further, that's sort of the primary interpretive debate in this space, right? Is the Second Amendment limited to the militia context, which I think seems kind of maybe strange and antiquated to us today, right? But it actually was a major concern at the founding. Or does the amendment extend to private purposes like self-defense, which is the dominant reason for gun ownership in America today? So as I said, in Heller, the Supreme Court settled that question and held that the Second Amendment protects an individual right. That ruling was extended in various ways. It was applied against state governments. DC is federal, but it was applied to the states, eventually extended to include public carry of firearms in certain contexts. That's the word bear in the Second Amendment. But that's sort of where things stood after 2008, 2010. Now I want to move on to the second part, which is how is the Second Amendment, old, or maybe that's not the right term, but sort of backward looking in that it looks, as Drew mentioned, further back than even the post-World War II period, all the way back to the founding, and sometimes even further in England. So the Heller case was what we would call as lawyers an originalist decision. That means that the justices, and actually even the dissenting justices, were asking, what did the words of the Second Amendment mean to Americans at the time they were written in 1791? Not, what do those words mean to us today? And so Heller, to do that, consulted a lot of historical evidence, as you might imagine. And lower courts continued to sort of emphasize history in various ways when they evaluated Second Amendment challenges after the Heller decision. However, the test that sort of developed in this period between about 2008 and 2022 also gave some weight to the modern justifications for gun laws, right? Empirical evidence about what works and what doesn't. And if that evidence was strong enough, courts would uphold gun regulations even if those laws didn't exist in 1791 or 1868 or some point in history. That brings us all the way up to 2022 when the court decided its next major Second Amendment case. This case is called Bruin. And in that case, the court rejected this sort of piece of the test that considered modern empirical justifications for gun laws. So what the court said is that the way you determine whether a gun law is constitutional is that you ask, as a judge, whether it is consistent with historical tradition. And the government, in most cases, is going to bear the burden of actually pointing to similar laws from the relevant point in time, whether that's 1791, 1868. There's some debate, but usually it'll be the 18th or 19th century. And so under this approach, the old is really dispositive, right? If states did not regulate guns in certain ways in early America, then a modern law is going to be unconstitutional. As I think you might expect, this new history-focused test has resulted in a lot of uncertainty. Courts have struck down a lot of gun-related restrictions that they had previously upheld. Happy to talk more about that. But that's sort of a brief overview of where things stand on the legal side. And to sort of bring this into the conversation about gun country and talk a little bit about gun ownership. As Drew mentioned, there's no gun census, right? There's no registration requirement for guns in the United States, and there can't be. So we don't really know exactly how many guns there are in private hands, and it's difficult to track how that has grown over the years. I think Drew does a really good job, however, tracing how gun sales tend to spike when there's fear of increased regulation, right? That has been true looking over the past few decades, certainly. That said, I think you can sort of draw a through line going back 2 decades maybe of a relaxed regulatory environment encouraging increases in private gun ownership. Now, part of the story there is the courts. Again, if you want to have a gun for self-defense and you want to carry that gun in public, lowering restrictions about who can carry guns in public might encourage you to go out and buy a gun. But part of that is also just political deregulation, right? Many states have been deregulating based on political forces. That's happened here in North Carolina. And so that's also something that's important to keep in mind. I think that's probably as fast as I can give sort of a very high-level overview of the law. But so I'll turn it back to you, Paige.
Thank you for that. I also wanted to sort of kind of talking about it from a cultural perspective. This is something I think about a lot, and Kyle, I'd like you to kind of share more about it. But kind of as a young person, I only graduated from college a few years ago, so I've kind of grown up in a world where like guns are just everywhere, and gun violence is everywhere, and I don't really know like what it was like to kind of be in a world where the news wasn't just depressing and scary, and kind of having this underlying fear of gun violence and mass shootings happening. There was in Raleigh, the mass shooting that happened in Raleigh a couple years ago happened just 20 minutes down the street from where I grew up, and obviously I went to college here, so when there was a shooting here, it really touched me very closely, and kind of this, I think a lot of people feel like we're kind of sitting ducks, and like every shooting gets a little bit closer, and you're just constantly in fear of one day it happening to you or someone you know. But Kyle, as a student and as a young person, I'm just curious if you get the sense that you and your peers also have this feeling, and has it kind of prompted you to really fight for change?
I think that's a great question. I think following the two incidents, that happened last semester, really early on in the semester, unfortunately, and one resulting in the death of a professor, I think most students just felt very, insecure, very vulnerable. I felt like a lot of people didn't have time to recoup and, really take the time to process. I think the number one thing is that trauma, shows up in different ways, and unfortunately, the school schedule doesn't really allow for that, proper healing. So I think a lot of students feel upset, but at the same time, that rage and that, disappointment has actually turned into a lot of action. And, I think a lot of students being like this lockdown generation, that's our reality. But we're also very aware, just like these international examples, that this is something that is preventable, right? And I think the more and more that you accept that, and really, even when you're devastated by things like the pistol purchase permit repeal that just happened about 6 months ago in North Carolina, or even right now, the fact that red flag laws, which would allow people who might be at harm to themselves or other people to potentially get a court order that says you cannot purchase a gun, the fact that that hasn't been passed in North Carolina and has continuously been rejected by the Republicans, that's devastating, right? It's easy to kind of feel like you're a sitting duck, but at the same time, by doing nothing, you just kind of watch things happen. And I think when you approach it in sort of a new way, which is, hey, maybe we have to rephrase this. Maybe it's not gun control, but it's gun safety, which is something that everyone can kind of get on board with, I think. Maybe it's, having those tough conversations and figuring out what's this consumer aspect, what do we have to tackle here? What's the deeper meaning for why you feel as though you have to have a firearm to protect yourself? What does that say about your community? Even talking about like violence intervention, right? A lot of times these things in terms of gun violence are not mass shootings. They're happening in the house. They're domestic violence. They're community, interpersonal violence. So I think going to the schools, going to the education system, and really trying to figure out what's happening, what's perpetuating that culture is also very key. But that's not to say that it's not devastating, as a young person. And I definitely resonate with what you said and being, fearful.
So after what happened at UNC, obviously you all have been organizing since well before that, but after what happened at UNC, did you notice among the student body or among the community kind of a sense of renewed purpose, or more people wanting to come together and join you all in demanding change from representatives?
Yeah, I think so. Like I said, a lot of students are pretty upset, and I think anger can be very productive, when we're all coming together and really strategizing. I think a lot of students have always been upset about this because this is, again, their reality. But a lot of people were willing to join the team. So there's Students Demand Action, but there's also March for Our Lives and Young Democrats. And we hosted a collaborative rally pretty soon after the first incident that resulted in the death of Professor Yin. And I'd say about 100, 200 students came out, and people were trying to register to vote. People were trying to figure out how to get involved. So I certainly agree with that. And I also think people want to learn more. even though we might feel like we understand what's happening when we see these news articles, I think it is sort of a complex topic. I don't think the solution is that complex. I think it's kind of simple in many ways, but I do think people really wanted to learn more. And so we had a few people go to the General Assembly, which was one of the main ways to just kind of get in the face of people who are, actively making these decisions. And I think that's been pretty powerful as well.
So you talked some about people wanting to learn more. So I guess what do you and Students Demand Action do to raise awareness and help people learn more about gun safety and how it can be achieved?
Yeah, so I think Students Demand Action, our work is kind of two areas, education and sort of like advocacy work. The education aspect can kind of show up in the form of panels like these. We've hosted a few panels with, experts and public health experts, but also just like community activists. So that's one of the ways that we've been able to engage students. But I also think just like tabling and having those conversations kind of quickly is helpful. Students are busy, they don't have time to always go to an event. But when you grab them and you just say, how did you feel on the days of these incidents? What do you think can be improved? What are you concerned about? You're able to kind of have those enriching conversations. And like I mentioned, sort of the second part of our work is really just behind the scenes trying to improve public safety on our campus. And so one of our biggest concerns after those two incidents was that there were a lot of issues with the alert system that we use at UNC. The main one being that it just is only in English. So a lot of our staff members, a lot of people were completely unaware of what was happening. So you can imagine how horrible that is. And so we've been trying to work with the chancellor, now the new interim chancellor, to improve that. I think also the fact that a lot of our buildings, they don't lock properly. It's an old school, and we want to maintain that beautiful architecture, but we also want to improve, right? Because there's a lot of danger there. And then finally, just trying to make sure there's more of a systematic lockdown process has been one way we've been trying to improve that.
And you mentioned that that it can be really easy to kind of fall into despair and sometimes even kind of grow complacent. Would you say that there are aspects of the work you do that kind of help you find hope for the future?
Yeah, I think a lot of our work also centers on like community healing. Like I said, this is the type of work that will beat you down, and I'm obviously quite young, and a lot of my mentors in this space are always saying, you guys got to take a break. We have to come together. Let's have a moment just to share some pizza and just talk about life. But it seems funny, but it's so important. And so I think that's one of the ways that we're able to center healing and center community in this type of work. In reality, none of these things can get done alone. We need everybody showing up at the General Assembly. We need you guys showing up at the polls. And so I think, centering community is key.
Drew, I want to circle back to you because at the end of the book, you talk a little bit about this, but I'm curious, based on just kind of everything you know about where we've been and where we are currently, where do you see just our, I guess, as you call it, gun country kind of going from here? What do you think that the future could look like?
Yeah, it's a really hard question. You never want to ask a historian to predict the future or think about the future. But I'm so grateful to have Kyle here and this activist perspective today. And I'm grateful to Paige for pointing out that I'm an old person now. And there is a real generational divide here. And I think the way the two of you have talked about it really points to that. And Kyle, you said a key word, or a key phrase now, which is gun safety. And that's a phrase that has replaced the phrase gun control, right? Control, especially for Americans, always has negative connotations. We think about ourselves as a people of liberty and freedom and individual independence and so forth. And so we don't like to use the word control because it has certain connotations to it. But that was the phrase that the first generation of activists used in the 60s and 70s. And they really meant it. And the way they talked about it was influenced a lot by what at the time was called modernization theory, the idea that not just individuals, but states especially had an obligation to impose control on society for the benefit of everyone. They had an obligation to impose control on the natural environment. In fact, they had certain expectations that they could impose control on a natural environment, and that they could shape the way societies developed with certain policies that encouraged, in their mind, the growth of a kind of liberal democratic society. This has its most awful consequences in places like Vietnam, where according to modernization theory, Something went off the rails when communism intervenes. But that same kind of thinking they apply, and a lot of these are like liberals who've been influenced by the New Deal, the power of the state to transform society. A lot of them apply that thinking to guns, and they argue that we need to control our natural environment, and we do that by controlling dangerous things and the tools of violence in our environment, because we are civilized now, and civilized societies control the tools of violence. And of course, that language didn't win. In 1968, they got the Gun Control Act passed. It took them many years to pass it, and it was very watered down and had very little impact on gun violence rates and on gun ownership in the United States. And really, arguably, from that moment forward, gun control became kind of a dirty word, to the point where it gets erased in the 21st century and replaced by gun safety. And the key to the phrase gun safety is as Kyle pointed out, I think, which is very insightful, like, you live in the gun country. The guns are everywhere. The guns aren't going anywhere. That was the idea about control in the 60s and 70s, is that we can do something about the guns. We can even remove the guns from society. But in a country of 500 million guns, you can't get rid of the guns. All you can do is keep yourself safe from the guns. When people ask me to think about the future, I of course, I think about the past. And I think about 1968 and what happens in 1968 after MLK's death, after MLK's murder, after Robert Kennedy's murder, both shot to death. Lyndon Johnson appoints a commission. Lyndon Johnson loved appointing commissions, and he appoints another one in the aftermath of RFK's killing, and it comes to be called the Eisenhower Commission. It's named after Milton Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower's brother. And that commission is tasked with investigating violence across American history. And one of the task forces within that commission is specifically tasked with investigating guns in American history. It's the first time the federal government has ever done any kind of serious investigation about guns in American society. 1968, the first time the federal government has learned anything about guns in American society. And there's a lot of fascinating conclusions there, and I get a lot of material from the book from their research. They just stockpiled all this stuff, and they discovered things for the first time that I was rediscovering, 60 years later. But one of the conclusions they come to is that we are at a turning point now in 1968. We think right now in 1968 there's about 90 million guns in the United States, and we think there's maybe 25 million handguns, which are the most important kind of weapons to control if you're going to control violence. Because as Kyle pointed out, so much violence is interpersonal violence, it's domestic violence. 70 to 80% of people who are shot by somebody they know. It is not, most gun violence is not random. And so we need to control those 25 million guns. What do? We got to take them out of people's hands. We have to confiscate them. And we know at this moment in 1968, with 25 million of them out there, that would be the most dramatic act of property confiscation that any liberal democracy has ever gone through. But this is the turning point right now, because if we don't do it, 25 years is going to be 200 million guns. 25 years later, there's going to be 400 million guns. And they were right, and nobody took the guns away. And now we're not talking about taking guns away, because you can't have those conversations anymore. Because as Andrew pointed out, the interpretation of the Second Amendment has changed dramatically in the last 60 years as well. So now we can only talk about how to keep ourselves safe. And that's when I look to people like Kyle, and it's like, you have to figure it out, because every generation before you has failed in that regard. And all you can do now is think about how to keep yourself safe rather than how to control these objects that are now fundamentally uncontrollable.
And Andrew, I also just wanted to ask, do you think that, or what do you think, if there are any, the legal challenges to these sort of, this kind of gun safety legislation or gun, or as we used to call it, gun control, within the framework, the Second Amendment framework that we're working with, is there any kind of legal or constitutional hurdles that have to be overcome to make that happen?
Yeah, so I think the main takeaway, as maybe was clear from what I was saying earlier, is just the amount of uncertainty that we have at the moment on the ground about what the Second Amendment test looks like, right? What does it look like to have a test that is so history focused that you need to dig up gun regulations from 1800, 1790, right, and come into court and say these are the laws that justify this modern regulation? And courts are still sorting that out. It's possible that even the Supreme Court will change some aspects of this new test because it's just been very difficult for courts to implement. What I will say, as far as just this general question about where do we go from here, is that what always strikes me is that you have such a stark partisan divide on sort of basic questions about gun regulation, right? The question can be phrased differently, but just general questions like, do you support stricter gun laws, right? You get just massive divides, Democrats versus Republicans. That's been growing and growing in recent years. When you actually drill down and ask more specific questions about specific types of regulations, it's kind of shocking sometimes how much agreement you get. Kyle mentioned red flag laws. That's one type of intervention where I think you still see pretty high support across the board. Things like universal background checks, safe storage laws of certain kinds, right? So that always gives me some hope, right? I mean, there is, when you break it down like that, there is actually broad support for some of these measures. But again, that's the partisan divide on the general question is so large.
I also wanted to open it up to any questions from the audience. If anyone here has a question for any of our panelists about anything we talked about or anything we haven't talked about that you're just curious about, or any comments that you have.
I'm curious about the Republican Party's Southern strategy to turn the South Republican, which was coupled with the black people are going to kill you soon. They're all rioting in the streets. They're filling our jails, so you better get armed. It was a very powerful message delivered to this country. And I'm curious if the increase in gun sales parallels that development.
Yes, absolutely. So for those of you unfamiliar, the Southern strategy refers to the Republican Party strategy for Nixon in 1968 and then again in 1972 to try to win those Southern states over, which had historically been Democratic, because the Democratic Party was the party of secession, it was the party of Jim Crow, it was the party of states' rights. But with the various upheavals and political changes of the 1960s, particularly Lyndon Johnson signing into law the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the South was essentially up for grabs. And so the Republican Party saw an opportunity there, and Nixon, of all people, saw an opportunity there to sort of swoop in and claim those Southern conservatives for the Republican Party. And that's, the fundamental switch in the parties that we live with today. And that absolutely tracks with gun sales and greater attention to. So among other things, it's 1967 and 1968 are the first two big boom years for gun sales in the post-war era. And that absolutely tracks with not just the election of 1968, in which Nixon starts talking the language of law and order for the first time, right? This becomes, as later we'll call these dog whistle phrases, these are phrases that Nixon uses to say, I'll control the urban populations, black urban populations that are rioting. I'll control the hippies on campuses. I'll control anti-war protests and so forth, because I will restore law and order. And so this is the message to his, what he describes as the silent majority. And so on the one hand, we have that election coming in 1968, but also everybody knows a gun law is coming. And so gun manufacturers and importers are increasing their stockpiles in 66, 67, and 68 in anticipation of that. And then there are the upheavals of 67 and 68. There's Newark and Detroit in the summer of 67, both erupt in violence and rioting, in a broader sort of social uprising against police brutality, against inequality in the cities. That story repeats itself in 100 more cities in 1968, especially in the aftermath of King's killing. And so that's where we see the real spike in gun purchases. And overwhelmingly, those are handguns. Just one example I talk about in the book, Detroit, for instance. Detroit had a law, as many cities did in the 1960s, that handguns had to be registered. If you lived in the city, you had to register your gun with the Detroit Police Department. In 1966, there were about 4,000 handguns registered that year in 1966 in Detroit. In 1968, there were 18,000. So more than 4 times as many over the course of 2 years. And the most important figure here to note is that the Detroit Police Department said for every 1 registered handgun, there are upwards of 50 unregistered handguns. So you're talking about an increase, if we go over 4 times, of upwards of 500,000 handguns just in the course of a year or two. And so much of that is driven by the insecurity of the moment, of the urban uprisings, in particular white suburban populations. There's all these kind of quirky, they're meant to be like sort of quirky, funny, ha-ha stories, which in retrospect are terrifying, of like police departments in suburban Detroit going out and teaching women how to shoot in like women's clubs and that sort of thing, and helping them buy guns, and that, because the idea is the scary city is going to rise up and we need to be armed and prepared to fight.
Thank you.
Question for Andrew. So for when the Second Amendment was being written, just to I imagine you've studied other materials that were written around that time to put that Second Amendment in context. So hypothetically, if one of the writers of that was here now, how he or she might explain to us what was their intention of what they meant the Second Amendment to accomplish.
As the historian, I'm very eager to hear this.
That's a $1 million question in my field. But the interesting thing is that I mentioned originalism, right, as this kind of theory of constitutional interpretation. The Heller case is often sort of held up as the paradigm of originalist interpretation. The focus, at least in this version of originalism, over the one that's sort of taken hold in the past couple of decades, is actually not on what the intent of the drafters was, right? So it's actually, judges aren't really trying to figure out what James Madison was thinking when he wrote, the Bill of Rights. They're trying to look at the original public meaning, right? So what did these words mean to Americans at the time, which in theory sort of broadens the inquiry, right? And you would look at many different sources, right? You might be looking at, letters or books that were written around that time, newspaper articles, right? So it's broader than simply original intent. I think that also makes it potentially more problematic, right? Because there might have been different perspectives even at the time on what the words meant. So to the extent that there is a sort of unitary public meaning, I think that's really hard to say what it would be. I don't know that there is one, right? There may people in different parts of the country at the time may have felt differently. They may have viewed the words differently.
But in terms of the people who actually wrote it, what do you think that they might, if they were here now, how James Madison was one of the writers, what he might have to say to hypothetically, if he was here now, that this is my intent or our intent in writing this?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I only push back because I think that's sort of the reason for the departure from a focus on original intent, right? The inquiry itself just how would you determine that, right? I don't know, even a lawyer or a historian. I don't know who could say what he would have thought or if he possibly could have imagined the developments that Drew talks about, this explosion of gun consumerism. I don't think he could have, and so I think it's really hard to put words in his mouth.
So neither Madison or any of the other writers of the Second Amendment, they didn't have any other writings besides the Second Amendment itself, where they wrote themselves that this is our intent with writing the Second Amendment?
Is the question, did they sort of explain what they meant
Did they have
in other writings?
Yes, do they have any other writings that are existent of Madison or the other writers of the Second Amendment that expounded on their thinking or intention of creating the Second Amendment?
No, not really. What we have are the debates in the Constitutional Convention, right? So we don't have sort of really private writings of here's what we really meant or that type of thing, right? But we have records of the debates, and I'll say that those frankly don't at least in my opinion, aren't extremely helpful for the types of questions we're talking about today, right? I mean, they relate to things like whether there should be an exemption for those who, under their religion, cannot bear arms, right? Quakers. So I mean, the things that they were debating at the time were things that don't really translate to the modern discussion.
Which is, and the key point there is that there's actually very little debate about the Second Amendment, because there's general sort of consensus that it has something to do with militias and their relationship to the state, whether the state be like Virginia or the federal state. And there's no discussion whatsoever, absolutely none, about the Second Amendment as something specific to an individual's right to own a firearm independent of service in a militia. They simply didn't have that conversation, in part because their general assumption, which was not necessarily rooted in the debates about the Constitution, was that, of course, you can own a gun. That's one of sort of the basic liberties they sort of assumed for a free people. And, as Andrew mentioned, you can go back to English law and find some roots there as well, though that gets complicated too. But there's very little discussion about what the Second Amendment means in those constitutional debates. You can look at, for instance, the ratification debates in Virginia, and they're a little bit more extensive on the debate about the militia, in part because Madison is the author of the Second Amendment. He writes it's a bit more wordy, his original first draft, and then a Senate committee in 1790 or 1791 hacks it down a bit, and we get the 27 words we have today. But there's a lot of debate about it in the Virginia Ratification Convention. And most of that debate is driven by Patrick Henry, who's the very powerful and influential governor of Virginia at that moment. And of course, we all know Patrick Henry. But Patrick Henry is also a slave owner. And Patrick Henry is interested in defending property rights in Virginia and the right of the Virginians to use the state militia in the instance of a internal insurgency, an internal uprising of enslaved people. And so Patrick Henry wants guarantees that the states will be able to control their militias, because there's a concern that the federal government or those Yankees up north who have anti-slavery sentiments might use a militia controlled by the federal government, or might deny Virginia's right to use the militia once it's called out. And so the Virginia property owners, slave owners in particular, wanted a guarantee that the state would be able to organize their own military units from the population in order to put down internal insurgencies. And of course, the thing that every white slave owner in the South, the constant fear they lived with, was a slave uprising. And this is also the moment, not incidentally, of Haiti, right? Haiti comes in 1791, when the enslaved population of Haiti does rise up against their slave masters, and this is the apocalyptic nightmare that every Southern slave owner feared. And so, Andrew is right in the direct words of the debates around the Second Amendment and the Constitution. There's very little debate about what it means at that moment. The historians are divided. The historians think the legal scholar, not Andrew, but the other legal scholars are ridiculous in a lot of ways. Because when historians look back and put things in context, right, the key word used there is context, is the debate is often the broader concern is with standing armies and slave insurgencies. There's just simply no debate about whether an individual can own a firearm in 1789 or 1791. In fact, a lot of state constitutions already say that in 1789 or 1791. I think it's the Pennsylvania state constitution is the first one, and then a bunch of other states copy and paste that one, which has a clearer sort of statement about an individual's right to own a gun. But there's simply no debate about that when it comes to the Second Amendment. It's always a question of the militia. And so for historians, the question is not, did the writers of the Second Amendment want to guarantee an individual right to own a firearm independent of the militia? For historians, the question is, what do we mean by militia, and what did they want to do with a militia? Because that other question is irrelevant, because they weren't talking about it in 1789.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in briefly. So after you finish Drew's book, I'd recommend there's a book called Madison's Militia by Professor Carl Bogus. There are a number of books about it. I mean, people have written at length about this question of sort of what motivated what motivated James Madison. That book specifically talks a lot about the Virginia ratifying debates that Drew mentioned. My takeaway is it's really not clear, right? I think that's a very compelling theory, but I'm not sure.
So I think a lot of people would be very surprised to find out that from a historian perspective that the right of an individual to bear arms was irrelevant to the Second Amendment at the time it was written.
Yeah, I think that's intentional. I think that's what the gun rights movement of the last 60 years has intentionally obscured and wanted to. They won, right? They won that debate. If you ask Americans if the Second Amendment guarantees their individual right to own a gun, independent of any kind of military or militia service, I don't know, it's got to be 80+% of Americans say that, Democrats and Republicans, and so they won that debate. But the historians will keep chugging out the work, even if.
So we just ask.
Maybe if we we could definitely talk afterwards, though. Okay. We have a couple of hands.
I'm curious, when you talked about after World War II that there were all these firearms in Europe, why weren't they snatched up by European civilians? Why did they all enter the American market?
Yeah, well, they couldn't. Europe has laws about civilians
Can you
owning
talk
lots of
about that, about why they couldn't enter the European
Yeah,
market
sure.
and
So
what the ramifications are now, all these years later?
Yeah, so among other things, European societies have laws about gun ownership. These are firearms owned by European governments, right? And so these are European governments that just went through 6 years of war and are not interested in distributing tens of millions of firearms to their population that just lived through the most devastating war in European history. And so these guns are sitting in warehouses owned by governments. These governments are also, by the early 1950s, they're getting new guns because many of them have entered NATO with the United States, right? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the first permanent military alliance that the United States enters into, and that commits the United States to supplying, being the arsenal of democracy it was during the war, it will also be an arsenal of democracy during the Cold War, supplying new guns to these countries. So these governments don't really need these guns anymore. They don't want to distribute them to their populations. Their populations, for the most part, can't own firearms extensively. Their populations don't have money to go and buy new firearms. These are societies devastated by war, right? And this is almost a decade before we get the European miracle of the middle of the 1950s in which the continent is going to recover. So this is when you have some young entrepreneurial Americans who are in Europe after the Second World War, who spot the opportunities there. The most famous one I write about, who is just a character in all the worst and best ways, his name's Sam Cummings. Sam Cummings will eventually, by the end of the 1950s, own the world's largest private he will be the world's largest private arms dealer. He'll own a company called Interarms, which will be located in Alexandria, Virginia. And he builds that empire as a college student in 1948-49. He goes to Europe, and he claims in many cases he sees weapons still lying on fields out, and he says he makes these sort of sardonic jokes about how the tanks still have Hitler's fingerprints on them, that sort of thing, because Europe produced all of these weapons of war, and now they've stopped fighting war. So what is going to happen to all those weapons? Well, Sam Cummings has an idea. He's going to walk into defense ministries with a suitcase full of cash, and he's going to say, "Here's $300,000. Give me as many guns as you're willing to unload." And these the guns are expensive to maintain. Just to sit in a warehouse, if you don't want them to rot and warp, you've got to have somebody maintain them. You've got to have security for them. There were some initiatives to take them and sail them out to the North Sea and dump them in the ocean. That did happen by the tens of thousands, but mostly they're sitting in warehouses. And Sam Cummings recognizes that there are few legal restrictions, almost no legal restrictions on Americans owning these guns. And they're sitting there in warehouses. For $1 each, I can unload these rifles, clean them up. He uses the term sporterize them. This is where we first get the quote unquote modern sporting rifle, which is a military weapon that we claim to be using for hunting or something like that. He cleans them up. He builds an extensive logistics network to get these things to the United States, and he starts selling them in the United States for, in some cases, as cheap as $10 each. You could go to a gun store in 1955 and you could see a beautiful brand new hunting rifle made by Remington that would cost you $150. Or you could see that junky World War II thing for $10. And if you're someone who's, you haven't had guns all of your life, you're getting curious about, like, maybe I want to go hunting, I've got more leisure time, I've got more time to relax, you're going to try out that $10 gun. And maybe in a year or two, you'll come back and buy the $150 one. And so Sam Cummings gets rich selling those $10 guns. And my argument is that spurs, because the gun makers notice. They're like, what's going on? What's going on here? Why are we losing sales to $10 rifles that were used in the Second World War? They notice, and they're actually the first ones to sort of press Congress to do something about this. And so I argue that it's those kinds of importers with those cheap guns that create that mass market, that really kickstart that mass market after the Second World War. And eventually the American gun makers are going to get on board, and they're going to have their own cheap handguns that they'll be making and distributing in the 1960s.
Absolutely fascinating. I never thought about this before. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's another one.
You addressed my question.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe up front.
I was just wondering if, Kyle, if you could just tell us what's on the horizon for your organization and sort of what you all are working on and what the next sort of semester, years look like in terms of your activism.
Yeah, so I didn't have a lot of time to touch on this, but we have been working on a divestment campaign. It was launched last semester, beginning of the semester, and essentially, like it sounds, a lot of colleges and universities, they use their endowment to invest in the gun industry because it's quite lucrative. We talked about the economic aspect of this. And one of the kind of historical things about endowments is very hard to kind of track down, what is being used, what's being invested, especially at a school like UNC. But essentially, what we're asking UNC to do is either pledge to divest if they are investing or, basically say that they're not going to. And so that looks like a petition, that looks like trying to pass a student government resolution. We're currently in this phase of next student government, elections are actually taking place next week. So yeah, we're really hoping to kind of launch that and keep growing that movement. And then of course events and panels are always happening. We're having one next week in fact, so yeah.
That's a tremendous idea. Go after capital. That's where the energy has to be. I think you've got to stop harassing gun owners because you're never going to win political battles that way. But we can all agree that big capital sucks, and so I think that's the route, is to go after the companies. And there's been a little bit of success so far in that regard, right? There was the case against Remington that the Sandy Hook parents brought $73 million from settlement from Remington for its advertising related to the gun that was used in Sandy Hook. So I think that's a terrific idea, and I think a lot of energy. I'm glad to see energy going in that direction.
One thing I'll say is we would love to have some people sign our petition. I have a little flyers I can give out just to pub that real quick. Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about
One more question over there.
Oh, thank you. Question, attorney question. Recently in the news, there's been a lot of important story about the parents of younger people being held responsible for acts of violence, and just wanted some perspective on the legality, where you think the legality of that is, and maybe some of the effects that it might have.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you're referencing the Michigan case, where I think both parents actually separately charged. I will say, I'm not an expert on that case. I mean, I do think that it seems like kind of a uniquely bad fact pattern, right, and not necessarily something that would be, sort of open the door to similar types of litigation in the future. I mean, I certainly hope not. but it does sort of connect in certain ways to one of the types of policy interventions I mentioned earlier, which is safe storage requirements, right? So I don't think that this lawsuit relates to any specific safe storage law. I'm not sure. I think Michigan just enacted one, but that may have been after the shooting. But these are laws that generally make it a crime to fail to secure your firearm when there's a minor in the house. And that's again one of these types of interventions that has pretty broad support. We've seen some states enact those laws in recent years. It's pretty effective from the data I've seen, right? If you make it a crime to negligently fail to store your firearm, people are probably going to take steps to actually secure guns. So I think that's my primary takeaway from that episode.
I learned a fascinating thing recently about parents and school shootings. The Columbine parents, I mean, I knew this, the Columbine parents have never spoken to investigators. Oh, no, sorry, the Harrises, Eric Harris's parents never spoke to investigators. For years, they resisted until finally they agreed, maybe 2003 or 2004, to do a deposition. But they only agreed to do so if it would be sealed and tucked away in the National Archives for, I think it was 25 years. And so those will be unsealed and available to researchers in 2027. So we're coming up on that, which I didn't realize. So this question of what role parents have played.
Well, I was going to ask also a follow-up question on Sandy Hook. That was before it happened. The description of Sandy Hook would have been like something out of a horror novel, and I think most people would have thought that would be a like a dividing line of something that drastic would shift society, and so I'm not sure exactly how to frame the question, but I think a lot of people expected that change would occur after that incident. And I think a lot of people are shocked and dismayed and depressed that it was not, that nothing really happened or nothing really changed after that. And just any thoughts, commentary along those lines.
Yeah, well, we didn't get any federal action, right? Obviously, there's no federal action until 2022 in the aftermath of Uvalde, but there was a lot of state action in 2013. There's a question, which Andrew could probably address better than I could, whether or not that state action was effective. When he, first started speaking and said it's got to be effective, and you have to be able to measure the effects of it. I think of the SAFE Act in New York in 2013, which was advertised as the strongest gun law in the country, which proved to be very strong on paper, but not strong at all in practice, in part because a lot of sheriffs in upstate New York refused to enforce it. And there were no mechanisms built into the implementation of the law to ensure that it was enforced. So there were a lot of states that Connecticut also passed laws after Sandy Hook. A lot of, and again, this is Andrew's field, but a lot of gun law is state law as well. In fact, if the historians would say that the Second Amendment does not protect your individual right to own a firearm. That's not what the purpose of the Second Amendment is, but there are lots of state laws and state constitutional amendments that do. And so if, tomorrow which is not going to happen, but if tomorrow the Second Amendment were repealed, that doesn't mean American gun rights go away, because there's still many levels at which gun rights are protected in the United States, and also many levels at which gun rights are challenged. And so there was a lot of action after Sandy Hook at the state level, but I think everyone's disappointment came from, we had a Democratic administration, and clearly Barack Obama was devastated by these horrific events, and still we got nothing out of Congress.
I think this speaks to something that we didn't talk as much about, but it's definitely more of my knowledge area is just gun politics. I think if you polled Americans after Sandy Hook, most people would say yes, we need to do something about this. I think the public opinion, that sentiment was there. Everybody wanted to do something, but kind of as Drew
talks about in his book, like just the power of the gun industry and like as a result the gun lobby, like just the chokehold that they have over politicians, Washington, just in general, like makes it so hard to get these things done, even when kind of as Andrew said as well, like they have such broad public support like across party lines, but you just don't see that happening. I think like North Carolina, our two senators, like were two, Tom Tillis and our previous senator Richard Burr were two of the most received the most money from the gun lobby of any senators in Washington, and now we have a senator that's also a gun shop owner. So like just there's not as much of an appetite to kind of pass laws when you have when your pockets are kind of lined by the people who don't want this stuff to happen. So I think there's a real like disconnect between what people actually want, which I don't think there were a lot of people in America that saw what happened in Sandy Hook and said, I don't want anything to happen. But I think there's a real disconnect with what people actually want to happen and what politicians are willing to make happen.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add. So I mean, I think it's sort of some of the changes that were discussed after Sandy Hook, at least my understanding of what was sort of primarily proposed. Some of those are the types of interventions like expanding background checks, right? These sort of upstream, point of sale restrictions that have really broad support. And I think it's definitely possible to look at that as a political failure, right? Lobbying that defeated measures that have broad support. Some of the other measures that were proposed, for example, banning assault weapons, right? That's something where the data is much less clear, right? There was a federal assault weapons ban for 10 years. There are studies on both sides, right? It's not, nobody can say for sure whether that was effective or not. There were a lot of loopholes in that law, which may be part of the reason it wasn't effective. But I think that has sort of, has certainly influenced the discourse surrounding those types of laws. And now those, there's a pretty big divide on those as well. And I think it's about 50-50 maybe. So the polling on that is less clear.
Well,
You have time for another question? Are you finished? Or?
one more.
Sure.
Could you say more about that? I mean, capital invests very heavily in ensuring that their environment for making money is robust, and they spend it on politicians and in the legal system and in media. So could you just say more what you've learned? I haven't read your book yet, I'm sorry, but I assume you speak to that in the book.
So say it a little more. Can you phrase that in a sort of, because I agree with you,
Yeah.
but I don't know. Yes, that's my answer, but
Yeah.
what's the sort of...
Well, I'm just curious. I mean, you bring a lot of great new information about how we got to where we are. Not so much of what you said, though, is spoken to the extent to which money has been spent on influencing judges and developing judges who were pro-Second Amendment, and media that intentionally creates a sense of division around gun policy when there isn't a division around a fair amount of gun policy. And so how do we get, what have you figured out about that or discovered?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have any great insight beyond, the NRA is the most powerful and influential and successful consumer lobby in American history, without question, right? I mean, if you look at the overwhelming support for what are increasingly called common sense gun safety proposals like red flag laws, like universal background checks, and yet the ability to block all of those things, that is all the power of the quote unquote gun lobby. Of course, they've fallen on some hard times recently, but they built such a base of support, and there are a number of smaller but still intellectually and culturally influential gun rights organizations that are able to mobilize voters and communication to politicians. That I think that's where the real success has been. One of the ironies of the gun industry is that in terms of numbers, in like macro numbers within the economy, the gun industry is not very big. Now it's in like the low billions figures, maybe $4 billion a year or something broadly, the gun industry. But compare that to the defense industry more generally, and small arms, in sort of the defense term, are rather small in an economic sense. And yet the lobbies on behalf of that small piece of the economy have a truly outsized impact on politics. And I think a lot of that is not necessarily, that's why I don't think necessarily we could say it's all about the money, but it is all about organizations like the NRA, which are, they're driven by money, they're driven by advertising they have to get to support their initiatives, they're driven by membership dues. And they have really been, nobody's been quite as effective at mobilizing their constituency as the NRA has been historically. You can go all the way back to the 1930s and talk about the NRA doing that, and again in the 1960s, and then that's just accelerated dramatically since the 1990s, since the assault weapons ban in 94, the Brady Bill in 93. That was really since that moment, that's where the NRA really turned it on, and nobody's been able to beat them since then. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for your attention.